Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. George Osborne has extended the Help to Buy scheme to 2020. Danny says house prices will only rise from here to eternity. Indeed, the taxpayer stands behind the beloved British thumb-sucking teddy bear sleeping property speculator. There'll be no losing bets in the housing casino at all, Stacey Herbert. What is this teddy bear thumb-sucking thing about?
Well, 34% of adults in the UK sleep with a teddy bear, apparently.
What? 34% of UK adults sleep with a well, they also sleep with the Queen. The Queen looks over them. She's everyone's teddy bear.
I'm glad you clarified that. Well, we're going to talk about the housing market across the world because it's in the news again. And the first one is from the United States, why prosecutors whiffed on subprime crime. This is from Barry Ritholtz. And he asked, why did the government fail to go after so many perpetrators of mass fraud? And apparently, a Justice Department Inspector General report released this week raises that exact question. It found that DOJ did not uniformly ensure that mortgage fraud was prioritized at a level commensurate with its public statements, and that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, quote, ranked mortgage fraud as the lowest ranked criminal threat in its lowest crime category.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's great. If you are the bankers and you get to write the laws, then you deprioritize the law breaking that you are, in fact, committing. So mortgage fraud, it's a fraud. It should be prosecuted as fraud. But if you're the guy writing the mortgages, then you can co-opt the government to simply decriminalize or de-emphasize that particular fraud. And then when you commit that fraud, you pay a small civil fine. It's called banks and brokers have co-opted government, which is kind of, I guess, like fascism. Fascismo. Fascismo in America. Fascism, American style. That'd be a good TV show.
I know Chris Whalen is up in the second half, and we were speaking to him at dinner last night about the fact that there's so much easy fraud to prove. It's not just the complicated stuff like the collateralized debt obligations and, you know, trying to convince a jury that they understand what this thing is. The robo-signing, the mass fabrication of documents, the perjury, saying that these documents existed and were true. Those are simple crimes to prove, and yet they haven't been prosecuted. No young, eager prosecutor has even tried any of these cases. So Barry Ritholtz asks, why has this happened? Well, one of the reasons why he says is that the endowment effect and sunk costs fallacy. So they've already invested so much, the government, in TARP and ZERP and all of this stuff. So they own this issue now. Another one is the wrong players in key roles like Larry Summers and Timmy Geithner, the very people who caused the crime wave were put in charge of cleaning it up. And then finally, this is the one that I think you have always talked about, and that's economic threat. As observed last year, the greatest triumph of the banking industry wasn't ATMs or even depositing a check via the camera of your mobile phone. It was convincing Treasury and Justice Department officials that prosecuting bankers for their crimes would destabilize the global economy.
Yeah, and I like this endowment threat idea that we have so much invested in fraud, it would be foolish to turn back now and try to prosecute fraud. And of course, every time they do try to prosecute fraud, the bankers and the brokers whip out their threat to crash the economy and to crash the markets. And they've done that a few times to get their way. And the politicians, of course, are invested in these same stocks and bonds and options, and they're not going to argue against their own interest, having been vested themselves in the fraud. So you won't see any progress in correcting the fraud, but you will see the consequences of the fraud, which is enormous wealth and income gaps, an entitled elite that feels they have the right to commit all kinds of additional crimes. Because once you allow them to commit fraud with impunity, they simply extend that to other areas of everyone's lives.
Exactly, and now this is why I bring this up, this new Inspector General's report, that nothing has been done by the FBI or the Department of Justice regarding all those past subprime crimes. And the statute of limitations in the U.S. is almost up on most of those crimes anyway, but because there's a new round coming. Blackstone's home buying binge ends as prices surge mortgages. So Blackstone Group is slowing its purchases of houses to rent amid soaring prices after a buying binge made it the biggest U.S. single-family home landlord. So they've declined by 70% in the past year. That at the peak, they were buying $100 million worth of properties per week, and they spent $8 billion since April 2012 to buy 43,000 homes.
Well, let's see if we get the whole history of this. Remember, it was Blackstone and Goldman Sachs that were involved in the subprime crisis. They fraudulently made loans. They fraudulently sold repackaged loans to their own customers. They fraudulently made bets against their own customers after fraudulently selling them the fraudulently packaged mortgages that was condoned by the fraudulent regulators in the U.S. The subsequent subprime crisis forced millions out into the street during the foreclosure crisis, which was, by the way, aided by fraudulently overlooking foreclosure laws. This, in turn, created a housing bust where the folks like Goldman and Blackstone moved in to buy these properties for pennies on the dollar. Now, flash forward 5 years, and they have stopped buying these properties because the easy money is no longer on the table. They're tired of being slumlords, so they're going to walk away from these properties as any slumlord would do, and the housing crisis will once again resume, and a lot of people will once again be thrown out of their homes, and once again the economy will be undermined by the fraud perpetrated by the same actors who are never told to stop committing the fraud, and there's no deterrent to committing the fraud, and they pay a small civil fine, which is nowhere near the profit that they make committing the fraud.
They were all betting on appreciation in the price of the properties because you're not making any money. Blackstone's not making any money on actually renting them out. Because
let me jump in there for a second, because you're saying they're all betting on the appreciation of the prices that they themselves are engineering by all the free money they get from the central bank who is involved in this fraud. So you have a circle of fraud, 360 degrees of fraud, a daisy chain of fraud. You have Barack Obama, Eric Holder, Lloyd Blankfein, Jamie Dimon connected in the circle and daisy chain of fraud. You don't know, put tab A into slot B into tab A into slot B. It looks like Caligula on a bad day. It looks like the worst porno movie you've ever seen, where financial fraud is being stuck into every frickin' orifice you could possibly imagine, and they're spewing quantitative easing. It's like KY jelly to keep this orgy of fraud going until such time as somebody like Goldman Sachs says, oh, wait a minute, guess what? We just discovered we have herpes. And then the whole daisy chain breaks apart. Or Jamie Dimon says, oh my goodness, I've got craps. Then this whole daisy chain of fraud breaks apart, and you have a crash. And then the quantitative easing continues, and the whole thing starts up again.
Well, how they're planning on flipping it, of course, is subprime again, because subprime is back. It's called something different. It's now called another chance mortgage or alternative mortgage payments. And the two biggest players now are Wells Fargo, and Citadel is the biggest. Remember, it used to be Countrywide in the last subprime crime wave. They no longer exist. They've been sold to Bank of America. But this headline is Wells Fargo edges back into subprime as U.S. mortgage market thaws. See, the mortgage market is thawing just as Blackstone is trying to get rid of all these properties that they bought and drove the prices up. Still, Wells Fargo isn't opening up the spigots. The bank is looking to lend to borrowers with weaker credit, but only if those mortgages can be guaranteed by the FHA, Codell said. Because the loans are backed by the government, Wells Fargo can then package them into bonds and sell them to investors.
Right, so they want to restart the chain of events once again. They want the government backing of their fraud, which is, you could call it fascism, or you could just call it Wall Street circa 2014, where they get the government to backstop their fraud, and they don't want to take any risk. This is the key that one must understand, is that Blackstone or any of these banks, their money is procured risklessly. They do not, that's what, Tom Perkins, the guy over there at the venture capital firm in San Francisco, who recently equated the plight of the elite to the Holocaust victims. Okay? Tom Perkins is a guy who's made $1 billion or $500 million without taking any risk. That's the key. He's not a capitalist. He is Stalin on steroids, Tom Perkins. In other words, he just rapes and pillages and steals and grabs, and then he says, oh my God, I'm the victim. I'm the victim. I stole all your money, and I'm the victim. Oh la la, ooh la la. Tom Perkins is the worst excuse for humanity that's ever crawled out from under a rock.
So the loans from Wells Fargo will be to people with credit scores as low as 600, which is the former subprime, to 640. But Citadel Servicing Corporation, the country's biggest subprime lender, plans to package the loans it has made into bonds and sell them to investors. Citadel has lent money to people with credit scores as low as 490, although they have to pay interest rates above 10%, far above the roughly 4.3% that prime borrowers pay now. 10% these people are paying on the mortgage. They might as well take it out on a credit card.
They'll give a mortgage to a petri dish with some slime mold on it and say that that's enough for us of a credit score to give you $500 million in mortgages. We don't care because, of course, the government's backstopping all of this. And when the government of the United States can't find enough suckers, hey, let's invade Afghanistan. Let's invade Iraq. Let's engage Libya. Let's overthrow Ukraine. Let's do everything. Let's just go steal somebody else's money because we stole all the money in our own country.
But at least, in America, when this next subprime crisis collapses and goes crazy, people can walk away from their mortgage. Now, I want to look at a final headline here about Canada. Don't worry about skyrocketing Canadian household debt because Canadians pay their mortgage. First of all, let's look at this chart, and this is household debt to disposable income. The pink line is Canada, the purple line is U.S. As you see, Canada is at 164% of disposable income to debt, compared to the U.S. pre-crash, which is 130%. But these people here at QZ.com say, don't worry, because you know why? Canadians pay their mortgages. You can see from this chart, the blue line is the U.S., and that is the mortgage arrears by 90 days or more, and the pink is Canada. As you see, Canadians pay their mortgages. Why? They are recourse. They cannot escape their debts.
Well, this is always the story at the top of these real estate bubbles, whether it's Iceland, America, Canada. There's a feeling that, oh no, this could never happen because look at this chart that confirms our bias. And we'll keep confirming our bias with more charts until it blows up.
Yeah.
And then we're going to say, well, this was a once in a millennium situation that nobody possibly could imagine could ever have happened. But look, it crashed and now we need a huge bailout. We don't have any money, so let's join up with America and Mexico and go rape Chile. That's basically the policy directive you have in these countries now. They speculate wildly, they go bust, and then they steal, from other countries. It's basically Victorian era colonization via the global banking system, except instead of having big, nice breasts like Queen Victoria, you've got David Cameron in his moobs swinging around there without George Osborne in the House of Commons. You ever watch these guys? They look like Follow the Bouncing Moob. It's worse than Tony Blair.
But here, that's a good reason to short the Canadian market because these people are like slaves to their mortgages. These are genuine indentured servants to their mortgages. And this article is celebrating it as somehow sort of good news. Don't worry about the Canadian market. It can't collapse, even though mathematically it has to, because you can't have 164% of disposable income to debt and keep on going.
Well, I think Canada is a good example of what happens when you try to smoke maple syrup. Mm-hmm. All right, we got to go now, but thanks so much.
Thanks.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot maple syrup smoking. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with investment banker Chris Whalen. He's the co-author of a new book out later this year called Financial Stability, Fraud, Confidence, and the Wealth of Nations. Chris Whalen, it's time for part two.
Great to be back, Max.
All right, Chris Whalen, in the title of the book, you make a reference to Wealth of Nations. Okay, Adam Smith's 1776 classic of liberalism, economics. Do we currently have a system that Adam Smith would recognize?
In some respects, yes. You want to keep the great wheel moving.
What great wheel?
Well, that was Adam Smith's descriptive. In other words, it's a great wheel of commerce and finance. And the reason that the Fed and the other central banks printed all this money over the last few years, they didn't want the wheel to stop. That's really the simple way of looking at it.
He warned against people colluding, in moral sentiments.
That's right.
And when you have groups like the Davos or Bilderberg or these other big confabs, these are obviously opportunities for these guys to collude, isn't it?
Well, it is. Adam Smith was the means by which we democratized credit. We opened the game up. We took money away from the king.
So let's talk about another piece of the puzzle here, because during the banking crisis, there is this idea of the whack-a-mole, where a lot of the bad debts would end up back on the Fed's balance sheet and back on J.P. Morgan's balance sheet. Remember, Lehman Brothers famously did the Repo 105 scandal, where they took the bad debts and they put it next door to the bank they didn't tell the regulators about. Then the regulators would leave, and they put it back on the Lehman books.
Well, that's right. And it was fraud because they pretended to sell it to someone else, but ultimately they were still responsible for it. Citigroup. all of those off-balance sheet vehicles came rolling back when the investors didn't want them anymore, and suddenly they had to put capital underneath them.
Right, so that was the definition of that fraud, is that they were, what the definition between a sale was and not a sale was. So they go into the minutia of the details. It's a repo, and it's not really a sale, but it's maybe a sale, and this guy's maybe holding in the collaterals over there.
And we talk about this in our book. We get into the ancient antecedents of this. Louis Brandeis, the great Supreme Court justice, who really defined this in the mid-1920s. Nobody thinks about this anymore. But
we're going to talk about it right now, because there is a whack-a-mole candidate in the global, or the United States economy anyway.
Right.
And that whack-a-mole candidate that's sitting on a toxic pile of risk is Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yeah.
All right, now, so Puerto Rico is the new Lehman Brothers, potentially.
Well, it's a state, it's a sovereign entity affiliated with the United States, has way too much debt, not enough economic activity, and they're kind of limping along, but it's pretty obvious that they're either going to need to restructure, which is something nobody wants to talk about, or you could actually see a default under the canopy of the United States.
Now, is there going to be a ripple effect?
Well, I think so. You know, the funny part of it is that most people don't realize that Puerto Rico is part of the Second Federal Reserve District, the New York Fed.
I had no idea.
And the Puerto Rican banks repo all of their bad debt to the Fed of New York, so they actually own it.
And the Fed of New York is really the key in the central banking system. There are 12 of the satellite branches of the Federal Reserve System, and they comprise the Federal Open Market Committee, and the chairman is the Fed in Washington, he's the head, but then the New York one is really the guy who runs is Dudley, and he's got a position for life.
No, he doesn't have a position for life. That would be a disaster.
He's been there a while.
He has.
It seems like a life.
It does seem like a life, yes.
Is Jamie Dimon still on the board of the New York Fed as well as running J.P. Morgan?
No.
He's not. He was.
Yeah, he was.
But they...
Well, it was set up that way. It was set up to be an appendage of the banks.
Any conflict there, you think?
Yes,
you think
very much so.
Okay, so Puerto Rico is part of that system, and potentially they're sitting on a lot of crap that's going to blow up.
Well, they don't have enough income to service their debt. That's the simple way of looking at it.
Because now again, referring to my days on Wall Street, you know, you sell tax-free bonds to people.
That's right.
And they're rated by Moody's and Fitch, and they get AA or AAA, and then the interest rates are commensurate with the rating. And one of the bonds, municipal bonds, people would buy is the Puerto Rico, double B, 6%ers, you know, of O, whatever. And so a lot of retail people, a lot of retail brokers, and the retail market buying these tax-free or tax-advantage Puerto Rico bonds. As a result, this island of Puerto Rico has a huge amount of debt now, right?
They do. They, much like the United States, they have been putting off the day of reckoning by borrowing. They don't have enough activity on the island to cover all of their expenses, so they go out and they borrow in this advantageous debt market. And unfortunately, they're at the point now where they really can't borrow anymore.
Right, so they're going to, you think, default?
Well, I think either that or they're going to have to go to Washington hat in hand for bailout. Nobody wants to focus on this right now, as you can imagine.
Okay, just to remind viewers, your specialty is really on due diligence, credit analysis, and digging through the footnotes and the balance sheets and really doing a forensic look, because you're a deal maker, an investment banker, so you've got to look through stacks and stacks of paper to try to cut deals. So that's, you know, your livelihood depends on being able to sort through this stuff. So you've looked at the numbers. Puerto Rico looks like it's going to go belly up, essentially. Too much debt.
Too much debt.
So, but my question again is...
And they can't raise taxes. There's no obvious source of income to fix this. The federal government has been quietly pushing money under the table to Puerto Rico over the last few years.
They have?
Oh, sure. But the numbers are now so big that they can't make it work that way.
Do they get any copyright residuals for West Side Story, the musical?
No, I don't think so.
The Puerto Rican gang was either the Jets or the Sharks. I think they were the Sharks. They should be getting a copyright residual. That could keep the island afloat, and they could be dancing all day long. I want to come to the debt-burdened Puerto Rico. Could be a new musical. Get Stephen Sondheim. You could write it could be West Side Story Part 2, The Default.
Well, it would be interesting to see Barack Obama selling the bailout on Capitol Hill.
Dancing up and down the Capitol stairs with the Sharks and the Jets. I think I'd pay $5 to see that.
With his Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, who no one ever sees.
Yeah, what Jack Lew, he replaced, of course,
Timothy Geithner.
Timothy Geithner, who was all over the news for years.
Yes.
This guy Jack Lew is the invisible man. How come?
I think they want it that way. He's the budget expert. He doesn't really have much background in finance.
A lot of people like that job because they get to have their name on the dollar bill.
Yes.
Robert Rubin, I remember he was at a Knicks game a while ago, and he was signing dollar bills and the court side of the Knicks game, like, hi, I'm Robert Rubin, here's my name on the dollar bill.
Yeah.
So then you have Timothy Geithner, who I know grew up in the same town I did, Larchmont, New York.
That's right.
Right, so we were probably we're evil twins separated at birth. We're probably both playing at Flint Park at one stage of the game.
Well, more than likely.
And he's a part of the Larchmont Yacht Club. Which
Yes.
I'm not. I'm the Larchmont Yacht Club. I was at the another yacht club.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's Jack Lew. How much of an ego boost is that job? I just want to have that job to get my name on the dollar bill.
Well, I don't know. I've never been there. You'll have
Like
to find
Jamie
out
Dimon, for
yourself.
example.
Right.
Is he going to end up there? Because he's an egomaniac.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I actually like Jamie. I think he's a great operator. But look,
But you could say the same thing about Al Capone. Al Capone was a great operator.
Well,
And he evaded lots of laws, and then eventually had to pay the piper.
he did pay the piper, yes.
Yeah. So this is the thing about Wall Street guys, is that your book says fraud.
Right.
Fraud's bad.
Yes.
Jamie Dimon's caught committing fraud over and over and over again. So how is he a likable guy? If he's contributing to the massive social inequity that you see in the United States, how is he a good guy?
Well, it's with all of the big banks. If we're not going to enforce the rules across the board without any, favoritism, then why would you get mad at the bankers, Max? It starts in Washington. We have to enforce the rules.
But if they pay their way to get into Washington and they own the legal system,
well, that was clearly the case during the crisis. I mean, you had Bob Rubin telling Timothy Geithner what to do at the Fed of New York, and then you had Timothy Geithner telling Hank Paulson what to do during 2008. We go through this in our book. Paulson almost destroyed the world. Thank God for Ben Bernanke, because if you go through 2008, you look at each suggestion by Hank Paulson, super sieves, remember that? Bailout Citigroup?
Yes.
Disaster. The market almost tanked.
So Hank Paulson is kind of the bad guy in this equation in a lot of ways. People point to him as being kind of the weak link.
Well, there are two tracks at Goldman. You have bankers who do deals, and you have politicians, relationship managers, if you will. Paulson is clearly in the latter category, not a deal guy.
Right.
And when he was at Treasury, I don't think he understood half of the proposals that he made. And yet he goes around today giving speeches like he saved the world. Again, thank God for Ben Bernanke, because were it not for the folks at the Fed and the steps they took to counteract the ideas that came out of Paulson's mouth, we would all be in a very bad place right now.
So Paulson's just a schmooze guy.
Essentially a relationship
Schmooze,
guy.
a relationship guy.
There are two kinds of bankers, and he's in that second
So
category.
he's a schmoozer. That's it. He doesn't know deals from his elbow.
I don't think so. If he had understood what he was suggesting, well, classic example, the TARP legislation, they were going to buy bad assets. Nobody at the Treasury realized that you can't do that. It's illegal. And right up till the last moment, they kept saying, oh, we're going to buy the bad assets from the bank. It was only when the people from the federal government showed up, the lawyers, and said, no, you can't do that they switched gears early October, and they came out and said, we're going to put capital in the banks. Paulson didn't understand what he was suggesting, and neither did anybody in the Treasury.
I noticed that on Wall Street, when bankers break the laws, they claim that their financial engineering prowess has moved the art forward, and laws need to change to keep up with their genius.
No, that's bad. I mean, over-the-counter
But you
derivatives.
notice what I'm talking about, right? You know what
Yes,
I'm talking about.
Yes. Over-the-counter derivatives are an example of how we've gone a bridge too far. I mean, well, if you're selling something you don't own, isn't that a fraud?
It is. Well,
and you can't borrow it either, by the way. You can't deliver it.
naked short selling is
right.
you're selling something you don't own.
That's right.
Now, we saw that in the silver market.
That's right.
From who? Who's the number one culprit in that?
Well, in the
it
old
starts with a
days-
J, there's a middle name P, and there's an N name Morgan.
Right. Well, I'm thinking of the Hunt brothers.
Yeah, well, going back to the 70s. But we
Right.
just saw J.P. Morgan naked short selling massive ounces of silver.
But again-
Were you aware of that? You confirm
sure.
that?
Well, I wasn't following that specifically. I was more focused on electricity and the other commodities they were playing in. Our friend Josh Rosner has done a lot of work on that. But it's really, you go back to the Fed. The Fed has allowed the banks to do over-the-counter derivatives that let them sell anything. Anything you can conceive of.
Yeah.
You can go out and sell short, and you don't have to borrow it and deliver it. It's just a naked position. And yet the Fed thinks that it's okay for large banks to do that kind of business.
All right, Chris Whalen, we've got about 30 seconds. Okay, here's a simple question. Looking at all this big picture, isn't it true that one thing that can be done today to wean out most of the bad actors and excesses is to simply raise interest rates?
Well, I think they should. Yeah, rates need to go up.
Because the reason why there's so much fraud is that the cost of it is so cheap. Because the cost of borrowing money to finance fraud is near zero.
You mean the carry trade, the Japan
all the frauds,
trade?
all the derivative frauds, all these various carry trade frauds, all the credit default swap trades. If you can go out in the market and borrow money at near zero and put on a trade that's going to reap you 2 or 3 even basis points, but you've only got borrowed at zero,
Right.
and if you make a mistake, the government bails you out.
That's right.
Why not just raise rates or raise margin rates? It's in their purview in the central bank to raise margin rates.
Well, you certainly need to normalize them again so they reflect reality. We kept rates low to save the world from being decapitalized.
For 5 years?
Yeah. Yeah, we've gone too far. But
All
I've
right,
said that.
we got to go. The name of the book
Thank
is...
you, Max.
You're not yet. I haven't said goodbye yet. The name of the book is Financial Stability, Fraud, Confidence Games, and Wealth of Nations. Chris Whalen, Wall Street Titan, is the author. He's the co-author of the book. You should go check it out when it comes out on Amazon soon. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Fred.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Chris Whalen, co-author of new book, Financial Stability, Fraud, Confidence, and the Wealth of Nations. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.